Permission, what it is, what it does, how you get it. That's what I want to talk about. Permission is the act of officially allowing someone to do something. It's consent, it's authorization. You need it to drive a forklift truck, you need it to bake cakes for public consumption, and I think some of us need it to write, and to write well. I've been thinking about it lately because last year I ran a big poetry group, online group called 52, and when I asked people what they had got out of that project, so many of them said permission. We needed someone to give us permission to write and to write well. And I realised that a lot of people in the poetry community need some kind of permission, some kind of release. It sounds a bit Californian, but I found it to be true. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. There are certain barriers that stand in the way of us writing poetry. But the scale and the depth of that response from my 52 group made me wonder what it means to us as poets to have permission, where it comes from, and how being aware of it can help us to write more freely and better. So I've been working in poetry for about 12 years, and during that time I've worked on national projects, small-scale projects, and I've come across the same obstacles time and time again to people feeling comfortable in their writing practice. Most of us who make art, whether it's poetry or visual art or something else, need some kind of stamp of approval to get on with it and to do it well. I certainly did. And I'm going to tell you in a minute where it didn't come from and where it did and how it helped me to move on. What do I mean by permission? Something that gives you a feeling that you're allowed. You're allowed to write poetry and you're allowed to write it well. The obstacles, by the way, can be of your own making. But the good news is, so can the permission. So, let's get on with it. So, a few obstacles. What do I mean by obstacles? Things that get in the way. They can be things that you've made, or things that other people have made through love of you, through concern for you, through wishing you well. I was going to give you some examples from my own life and maybe from other people's as well. The first obstacle I came across to writing poetry was my schoolmates, who all went, ooh, whenever I used a long word. That is a fairly common experience, I think, that those of us who write and have always written get the mick taken out of us at school. We get kept in our place. What do we need permission for? Permission to write at all? Permission to write well? Permission to be your very best self as a writer and as a person. But above all, we want to fit in. People want to fit in with what's going on around them. Bad news, you're a poet and fitting in is not your job. That's not what we do, I'm afraid, and if you felt like you fitted in, you probably wouldn't have started writing poetry in the first place. The good news is, nobody else feels like they fit in either, and so the poetry that you write will probably speak to all those people who don't write it. Obstacles, then. What do I mean by obstacles? Who puts them in your path and what are they? One obstacle, from my experience, when I'm writing poetry as a child at Eckington Comprehensive School, the obstacle is all the kids who look at me and go, ooh, every time I use a long word, because they're keeping me in my place. They're stopping me from being too different. So that was an obstacle. And if I now write poetry which almost makes a fetish of plain speaking, it's possibly them that I have to thank for that. Other obstacles. The careers advisor at my school, who, when I told him I wanted to be an archaeologist, looked over his glasses and probably didn't quite know what an archaeologist was, but certainly gave me to believe that that was not a job I could do. So that was an obstacle placed in my path by someone who wanted me to be realistic and to look after myself and to have a good working life, but who actually put an obstacle in my path. If I think about other people and their obstacles, I've been speaking lately to Dan Cockrell, who runs the big poetry night Bang Said the Gun in London. His obstacle was, again, people's concern. People wanted him to stick with his teacher training course. They knew it would be good for him. They knew that it would provide a secure means of living. But he hated it and wanted to get out. So the obstacle in that case was their concern for him. In my 52 group, the obstacle for a lot of people was time. They felt they didn't have enough time. They felt that it was too late in their lives to start writing properly. Or they felt in some way that they were not entitled to write. Especially mothers feel this. Well, I have this very important job of looking after my children. I'm not entitled to make time for myself to write. That's selfish. So they're all the obstacles that might stand in your way. I'm going to tell you a bit about some of the people who gave me permission. What do I mean by permission? Something that gives you a feeling that you're allowed. You're allowed to write poetry and you're allowed to write it well. Okay, so examples of permission that I've had in my life. The first that comes to mind is a counsellor who told me when I was studying bilingual administration that I could change direction. I hated that course. I wanted to do something else. He said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, I want to go to Newcastle and study English and history." And he said, "Right, shall we make that happen then?" And he picked up the phone, talked to Newcastle, and within a year I was there studying it. The obstacle was not my stupidity or my failure or that I had to behave in a particular way. The obstacle was me not doing it, just not picking up the phone myself. And that was a real moment of release for me, a moment of permission. Sometimes I've given myself permission. So I, a few years ago, set up an exhibition of poetry and art about canals in Stratford-on-Avon. It took off, it had a tiny budget, but it succeeded thanks to other people's goodwill. And it led to a sequence of events which now sees me as Canal Laureate for the UK, living on a boat, writing about canals a great deal. These things have flowed one from the other. So a small act of permission can really release great things in your writing. And finally, I've arrived at a place where I give myself permission to be an expert in some ways, permission to sit here advising you on what permission is, for instance, and trusting that you might find something useful in it. And permission to call myself a poet. I'm really sick of hearing people say, "Oh, I don't know if I can call myself a poet. It's not a title one can give oneself, is it?" Yes, it is. It really is. If you're writing poetry all the time, if poetry matters to you in your life, you're a poet. Come out. Get out of the closet and own it. Why not? Thinking about other people and how they've got their permission to write. Dan Cockrell, who was doing that teacher training course, got permission from a counsellor who said to him, "Well, if you hate it, why not leave?" And he felt the weight lifting from his shoulders and he went forth and started to make a living in poetry. Tony Walsh, Longfellow, also makes a living in poetry. He used to work for the council, and when he was made redundant, it took a very great effort on the part of himself and his wife, who supported him by going to work a little bit more than she had done before, upping her days at work in order to support him doing that thing. That's where he got his permission. Kate Fox, who you will know from Radio 4 and from stand-up and from seeing at festivals all over the UK, carries with her a piece of paper that says Poetry Permit, given to her by a friend many years ago. And yes, I do have their permission to tell you these things about them. So, what do we need to give ourselves permission to do? First, permission to write at all. If you want to write, that's because it's a really important part of your identity. It matters to you. If the question has occurred to you, it really matters. If you want permission to make a corner of your spare bedroom into a study and put your poetry books there, or permission to give yourselves a couple of hours a week to write, that's the kind of thing you need permission for. If you're a working parent who feels that writing is somehow selfish, but doesn't feel that your child's violin lesson is selfish, that's something you need permission for. The next thing you need permission for is permission to write well. It's easy to write poetry, actually. All you need is one of these. It's the cheapest art form in the world, and that's its great virtue. But it's not easy to write well. And you have to give yourself permission to write not just the sort of poetry that makes your mates say, "Oh, that's great. I love the part about the bunny rabbits. I love the part about the revolution. I love the part about the love scene." permission to write as well as you possibly can, to acknowledge the people you aspire to. When I grow up, I'd like to be Norman McCaig. That's not going to happen, but I've given myself permission to explore very deeply his writing, the writing of other people I admire, to really examine it, to get inside it, to read critically, and to look at my own practice and try and make it better. I've given myself permission to do uncomfortable things, like working in collaboration with other artists. There's a tension there that sometimes informs my own writing, so that's really important. And permission, forgive me if I get a bit Californian here, to be your best self as a writer and as a human being. The act of writing is a generous act. Of course it starts egotistically. You're writing about yourself, or it means nothing. But if you don't write with enough space for other people to see their experience inside it, then what you're writing will not touch them and will not seem relevant to them. So give yourself permission to write as well as you can, as deeply as you can, and to be as generous in your writing as you can. So in one sense, this idea of permission is a silly conceit. You don't need permission to write in the sense that you need permission to drive a forklift truck. But it is vital. It does unlock stuff that you need to access to write well and to write deeply. Give yourself permission to fail, to get it wrong, because that's how you get it right. Here's a secret about writing poetry. We all want to write well. You don't get to write well without writing a lot of rubbish first. And that process never ends. You'll always be writing rubbish. Occasionally, you'll get it right. And on those occasions, release the fireworks, have a glass of champagne, go back and write the next one. You have to write derivative, cliched crap in order to get to the brilliantly original stuff which you know you can do. But you have to give yourself permission to do all of that. And give yourself permission to succeed. Actually, there's a quote from Marianne Williamson where she says something like, "Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate, but that we are powerful beyond measure." And I know that sounds a bit Guardian reading and wishy-washy, but it's true. Very often we're frightened that we might succeed and be exposed as ambitious or Emperor's New Clothesy, exposed as a bit rubbish, actually, when it really, really matters to us that we should be good. So that fear of success is sometimes an obstacle in our path. I just wanted to say a word about what success means to me, because success isn't necessarily about getting published, about being published in journals, about getting 2 million hits for your video on YouTube. That's all very nice. But actually the success that matters is writing to the best of your ability and the deepest of your craft. Take your writing seriously. Do it as well as you possibly can. Learn from other people, both gone and contemporary. And that's the best way, as it happens, to get the other sort of success, the 2 million hits on YouTube and all the rest. Take your craft seriously. Okay, so I hear little objections forming in your mind, perhaps. You might say, yes, it's all very well getting permission to do these very ambitious things, to collaborate, to work with other people, if you're good. Well, you don't get to be good without being rubbish first. You have to write your way through your craft like every other thing. You have to bake a few bad cakes before you get to the good ones, I'm afraid. You might say, but what do these people who have success, what do they know about rejection letters? They know plenty. They know plenty about rejection letters. Nobody has a 100% strike rate. So allow for the fact that people who you admire have had their failures and their fallovers too. And you might say, I'm too old, or I've missed my chance, or oh, I'm just a dabbler. Well, you're not getting any younger. As Arthur Ask said, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. But don't cheat yourself of the chance to do something that really, really matters to you. If writing matters enough to you for you to have even stumbled across this video and to have watched it this far, then it matters, and you need to address that. You might also say, permission is all very well, but it doesn't pay the bills. That's true, and that's a real concern. We've got to make a living. And so when I say you might want to find a way to go part-time with your job so that you can do writing in the other half of the week, you might say, well, I can't do that. I've got to pay bills. If that's a real and serious concern, then that's true, and that's the obstacle you have to work around. But sometimes it's an obstacle of your own making, and it might be really interesting to jump and see if you can fly. If you jump out of the window to see if you can fly, that's a wonderful aspiration, but you can't override the laws of physics. If you jump from your job to try and make a living in poetry, that's a wonderful aspiration, but you can't do it unless you are practicing the writing craft as deeply and as well as you can. You have to put in the hours. You have to take the enterprise of writing seriously, as I think most of us want to do. So that's a thing you really need to give yourself permission for. A lot of the time, permission might just be the same thing as honesty. Honestly admitting to yourself what it is that you really want so much that you barely dare say it out loud. And then permission to go and see if you can get it. So sometimes we limit ourselves, we put obstacles in our own way, or we allow the obstacles that other people have put in our path to really throw us off course. Because actually we think that poetry is a bit self-indulgent, is a bit of a whim, is not really a serious thing to do. And I'm going to say to you, poetry is far more than a self-indulgence. It is an essential part of what we can do creatively. It's a real, generous act of the human spirit. It's an act of shared exposure. It's an act of communication which goes far, far beyond the daily small talk that we do every day. Poetry is a force that can genuinely change people's behaviour, can genuinely change their politics, can make them think differently, can change their philosophy. A good poem can get you through a dark time. You know that. That's one of the things you like about it. Poetry can make people laugh, can make people feel slightly rude, can make people drop what they're doing and walk out of a job that they can't stand. Poetry can make people see the purpose of their lives, actually. And if you admit that to yourself and own it, it's a force for good. It really is. Here's the bad news. Not all poetry can do that. Only the good poetry can do that. So your business is to write the best poetry you possibly can. All this airy-fairy empowering advice about permission is all very well, but you may be wanting some practical steps, especially if you're at the beginning of a poetry career. So, what can you do? What can you give yourself permission to do that will help you to know what comes next? Well, you can start reading. Read a lot of poetry. And read on Google about poetry, what's happening in your area, what poetry groups there are. You can sign up to a poetry course, a residential course like Arvon. The Arvon courses are blisteringly good, and 2 or 3 times I've been on an Arvon course that has completely changed the course of my work and my feeling that I'm able to do it. So I really recommend those. Give yourself permission to make a corner of the house your own. If you share your home with other human beings, they do get in the way. So give yourself permission to have a corner of the study or the spare room or the living room and say, sorry, that's my space for writing. Give yourself a corner of the week to do the same. Wednesday afternoons, Mummy does her writing. See if you can get a friend to have the kids. Any of those things, whatever gets in the way, see if you can get it out of the way and get on with writing just a little bit, an hour or 2 at a time. Give yourself permission to submit to journals if that matters. It's not mysterious, it's not a black art. Just go onto their websites and see what their submission guidelines are. You have nothing to lose but the price of a second-class stamp, and sometimes not even that by sending work by email. But give yourself permission to be rejected, because that happens quite a lot with journals, and it happens to all of us. It's part of the price of being in the poetry community. Give yourself permission to comment on other people's work. So often I've heard people denied the critique and feedback that they need to improve their work because you and I won't step up to the mark and give it. So if you're a reader of poetry, you have every right to say, that's a great poem, Deirdre, but I think stanza 2 isn't really working. Could we lose the bunny rabbits? Deirdre has every right to say no, but give yourself permission to be a participant in the poetry community as well as an observer. There's a quote from the poet E. E. Cummings that I wrote down when I was about 17 or 18 and first trying to find my way to these extravagant, impassioned opinions about permission that I now seem to hold. He said, "To be nobody but yourself, in a world which is doing its best day and night to make you like everybody else, means to fight the hardest battle which any human being can fight, and never stop fighting." If poetry matters to you, then poetry is possibly the most important weapon you have in that battle to be yourself and never stop fighting. If you need permission from yourself, then grant yourself that permission. If you need permission from somebody else to get over the obstacles, then here it is. This is your poetic license. Your name goes here. It's valid forever. And this is what it says on the bottom. There's no getting around that. So give yourself permission. If that means doing a course, if it means finding yourself a mentor, if it means just talking to people in a local poetry group to develop your poetry further, or it means signing up to a Facebook group to talk about poetry in more depth, all of those things are available to you. The first step is to admit how important it is to you. Give yourself permission to take it seriously and get on with it. I'm going to give you some homework about permission. Make a list. Make a list of the things you really want to do, the things you really secretly want to do in your poetry. I'll share mine with you. I want to make a great big multimedia work with enormous scope that people will remember as a happening and not just as a text. And I'm working my way to finding out how that's possible. Whatever yours are, write them down. If it's submitting work to journals, if it's getting a book published, if it's winning the Forward Prize, put those things down on your list. Now put down the things that are getting in your way, the things that are really getting in your way, not the things that you're kidding yourself are getting in the way. Because most of the things that we consider as obstacles, you can get around them somehow, one way or another, tiny bit at a time. So make a list of those things. And then give yourself a little plan for what you're going to be doing a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now in your poetry. They're your landmarks. They're your things to navigate by. You can change them. In a year from now, you might have changed your ideas of where you want to be in 3 years. You're allowed to do that. Give yourself permission to do that. I pay the bill. I leave a tip. And when I turn, he's pulled that jacket on. Leans on the table edge so he can look me up and down as I walk back. And I am shaking, as I'm meant to be. He's practiced this before, and not on me. You have to laugh. You have to tug a forelock at such skill. You have to render unto Caesar what is due, plus interest. I walk back, slowly. I have practiced this before, and not on him. It's an exchange of small lightnings, an easy homecoming. We know the rules. We wrote the rules like everybody else, and as it goes, can no more step outside them than a river can be still. We're in, and just now, laughing as we swim.